Hello, everyone. I'm Nathen Amin, and welcome to the Aspects of History podcast. Today, I am very pleased to be joined by a titan of Tudor scholarship, Sean Cunningham. He is head of the medieval records at the National Archives, and all of us historians who work in the field, we know and deeply respect Sean's endless expertise in understanding really the intricacies of the period. Our knowledge begins in the records, and Sean has worked in this area for many decades. Now, I should just say, for my part, I first became interested in Sean's work in around 2009 when I first began to delve into the life and reign of the first Tudor monarch. I think Henry VII is, for me, something of the cool Tudor to study these days, and there has been much output about him over the last 15 or so years. But back then, dear listener, believe me when I tell you, there really wasn't much work about Henry for us to read. I had S.B. Crimes' 1972 biography to work with, and in particular, I had Sean's 2007 well-rounded and thematical offering, Henry VII. I'm on record as saying since then it has become the foundation of my entire work, my, Henrician Bible, if you will, and I have been fortunate to get to know Sean in the years since. He might not like me saying this, but he is our sensei, and I am overjoyed to welcome Sean Cunningham to the podcast to discuss his latest work, Henry VII, Treason and Trust. So, welcome, Sean.
Hello, Nathan. What a tremendous introduction. I'm sure it's not fully deserved because obviously we work collaboratively with everybody who's doing research, and we feed off each other's expertise and interests. So I'm as guilty as anyone else at seeing what everyone else is doing and benefiting from their interest and enthusiasm for this period, especially your work as well. I mean, making that connection to get Henry more noticed, get more people interested in the period. That's down to you, really, and a lot of other people who've used your work to kind of expand the importance of this period in tracing the course of British history.
Well, that's very kind of you to say so. And yeah, I like the word collaboration because that's definitely what it has been across the last decade. I think there has been, and we have touched on this in the podcast in the past, sometimes there has been this perceived competition perhaps between public history and academia, and one can't really exist without the other. In many ways, public historians are bringing new audiences to the subject, but we're building a lot of our work on the work that academics are doing in the archives. And similarly, academics do need an audience for their work, so it is very collaborative, and collaboration can be fun and it can be rewarding for everybody.
That's right, and I think it's helpful for me to work in a non-academic building. So I'm working in an archive where the records are kept, and we need to be able to access those records and interpret them, but also then to understand how they fit into the historical narratives that have been built up over all those decades, if not centuries, of scholarship. So to see everything in the whole is just part of that collaboration. You can't really build an investigation of the past without understanding how everyone's contributing, and then you can argue and discuss and interpret the evidence, but everyone's got something to offer because an opinion based on reading and study is valid as everyone else's. So it's part of the debate, and it makes everything churn around and get some new insights and moves things forward.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, God, where do we even begin with this discussion today? I think I could probably do a 10-hour podcast with you and barely scratch the surface on the original Tudor. But I suppose we need to start somewhere. So what is it about Henry, who some, of course, might regard as a bland character, a dull accountant king in many ways? What is it about Henry that has drawn you to him over the years?
I guess it started with that adventurous story, that peril of his early life. I mean, I came at it from studying Richard III, really, and seeing that 2.5 year period in the 1480s as a transition and the introduction of a dynasty we all know, almost became a caricature of, British history. The Tudors are are only about Henry VIII and his wives, are only about Elizabeth I. They might be about the Reformation or the dissolution of the monasteries, but Edward VI, Henry VII, Queen Mary, they tend to get overlooked. And the great things that are going on in their reign, in the terms of cataclysmic things in those reigns, I thought, well, Henry Tudor's still an outlier in this. What's interesting about that period that allows those other decades of the Tudor century to thrive, and England to kind of make that transition from a bit of a European inward-looking nation to some other different horizons by the end of the 16th century. So it was trying to see how Henry comes out of that story of the Wars of the Roses. How on earth does he become king in a landscape with so many different candidates, so many ups and downs, so many changes of king and regime, all those interests which are shared because these are all related cousins of the descendants of Edward III. So in a way, it's difficult to see how Henry could have really appeared as a credible candidate, and yet he did, and fortune, all of that luck on his side, it made it very difficult for a logical kind of approach to kind of unpick that and see how on earth he became the first of a new dynasty. Obviously, he didn't know he was going to be leading the way for the Tudor family to stay in power, because the reign is one of peril. So as the more I looked into it, the more I realised this wasn't an accountant king. This is a story of somebody achieving the almost impossible and then having to fight all the way just to keep his hands on the things he'd gained, and hopefully calm the country down so that his heirs at least could inherit and begin to build something for the longer term. It definitely came across as a reign full of firefighting, reactions, lots of threats that never seemed to go away completely, but definitely came in waves of real peril, and then some calmer periods where things might have looked like a new horizon was beginning to come into focus. So it was a reign that was really fascinating once you get into the detail of what was actually happening, because it's not straightforward. It isn't just bureaucracy grinding forwards and creating this sense of a irrepressible dynasty that's going to dominate and really build modern Britain. It was a very precarious period which could have ended in multiple times in Henry VII's reign. So that's what really attracted me. It was that continuation of the turbulence of the Wars of the Roses, and how Henry managed to survive through this and actually set things up for what came after him.
I noticed that behind you, you have two portraits. You have the 1505 picture of Henry VII in the National Gallery, and you have one of Richard III. So that's very fair and impartial of you on this most controversial of subjects. And I noticed that you say that your gateway to Henry VII was Richard III. For myself, it was through Henry VIII. Like most people, we pick up a book on Henry VIII, and that sometimes develops into more of an obsession about, should we say, the six wives and the whole drama of his reign. But for me, I always noticed at the beginning of almost every textbook you had about Henry VIII was this very brief mention of his Welsh father, who captured the crown in the battle after 30 years of all of the nobles killing each other. And the story would quickly just fast forward back to Henry VIII's story and Catherine of Aragon. And I mean, I don't have any hair now, but I was tearing my hair out back then about this. How could this story be overlooked? So it is interesting that we have come to Henry VII ourselves from either side of the two reigns that bookmark him, which is a shame, really, that he has fallen in between the cracks of two of England's most famous kings in many ways. He never stood a chance.
I felt that with Stanley Crimes's book, because it was very learned and very detailed on the government and the way Henry either inherited or changed the things that already existed when he became king. But it didn't offer any sense of, apart from one chapter, the king himself and how he struggled through these threats to his person and his family and the way he wanted to rule. So it seemed a little strange that you had this great achievement of setting up a Tudor system of ruling, which in some ways, because we didn't get the comparison with what the medieval pattern was, it didn't really seem to be anything other than a slow evolution. Or Henry, on the other hand, might have been someone who brought in something completely innovative. There was no sense of the catalyst. How did his circumstances drive a lot of this stuff? So I think for me, it was trying to go back and see what made him the figure that could either sustain either of those two views, either, the bureaucrat king who came with a ready-made plan, or somebody who inherited everything and just kept it all rolling without any seeming real danger to himself. We'd maybe heard about Perkin Warbeck. We maybe would have heard about the early threats to him before 1490, but it seemed to be like some sort of destiny that he would just roll through these things without really feeling any pressure, and then Henry VIII would inherit the money and the structure and go off to glory fighting the French, and then the Tudors were established and that was that. So it didn't seem to offer the nuance or the detail or the explanation. So I wanted to find out if Henry came out of some sort of background which was common to the nobles and the leading families of the 1460s and 70s, or if he had something really individual and peculiar which set that mindset of isolation, suspicion, observance, and then absorbing some of the influences that he might have experienced from a childhood that was dislocated and full of danger, and then an early adult life where he really didn't know one week to the next whether he would be secure or given up for political reasons. So I was beginning to get this picture of somebody whose character is forming up and has a particular set of baggage which nobody else in that period had. And that begins to then explain what comes when he's got power in his hands and he can begin to shape things the way that he wants.
Yeah, the lack of exploration for Henry's character, certainly up until recently, I do get asked about that quite a lot, and I often, quite in simplistic terms, place the blame at the Victorians and at Shakespeare. Shakespeare did not write the play Henry VII, of course. He completely skips over that particular reign, which doesn't help Henry VII have a place in the English or British consciousness. And then, of course, the Victorian historians, they seem to deeply respect and admire his constitutional aspects to his reign, his foreign policy, his financial policies. That's not really the kind of topic that would attract a more general audience to the subject. Where is the colour on the reign of Henry? So yes, I think you are right. Certainly up to, Crimes' 1970s heyday. He is a student, I guess, of some of the Victorian learning that is still continuing. Henry has escaped a lot of attention, but fortunately, work such as your new book, Treason and Trust, is looking at the man as well as the policies. So let's delve into the book a little bit. So, you open the book by looking at Henry's funeral. So you almost begin you do begin at the end of his life rather than at the start. And you pay particular attention, I think, to his effigy, which is made from his death mask. And this, you say, reveals a man who's in death, he had led a difficult life. He had a haggard face and he was exhausted by the trials of his life, one of unremitting struggle. And by opening the book with that, you are setting the tone for the work that follows. This is a book, isn't it, really, about Henry's challenges in keeping his crown.
Yeah, I wanted to sort of give that sense of an endless cycle of worry about what comes after him. And he's obviously a man who hasn't known his father and who's, for a lot of his life, been separated from his mother. So a family connection is not normal in the circumstances of the late 15th century. And therefore, he's coming to relationships with all kinds of different people with this very strange view of what connections you need to sustain yourself, either in your status as a leader or just as a person. How you relate to family, how you get on with your family and friends. All of that is tied up in this sense of how does he actually realize his ambition, and it's about working a way through all the challenges that he's had, and he's obviously had probably a lifetime's worth of challenges even before 1485. Or I think it's the thing that's strongest is that sort of unknown possibility that surrounds him all the time. He's almost at someone else's mercy, and now he's established a a relationship with the Duke of Brittany when he's in exile in the 1470s, but he's dependent on that being sustained, and he's got no control over the political circumstances and his position in the politics of Edward IV and Richard III, and how the King of France might view his position in relation to high diplomacy. So he's got no ability to influence that. And I think these things add up in his mind to things he's almost ticking off, that if he does get to the point where he can be in a position of influence again, maybe that's only by rejoining the English nobility, which is possibly what Margaret Beaufort is trying to engineer, in Edward IV's reign, just to have him come back into the fold, not to be seen as a threat, but to be integrated again. If Henry can achieve that, he wants to go back to being a normal figure, to learning how to run his estates and deal with people by being a local justice, or relating to his peers as a member of the House of Lords. So he doesn't really get a chance to explore any of that until he actually has to learn to be king on the job at the same time. So it's a very unusual set of stresses that he has to engage with, because at the moment he achieves power, he then is responsible for all the things he's never been trained to do, and having to pick all that up in real time as he's facing threats, the responsibilities of leading the person to whom everybody else looks for decisions. That's generating this strain that really, it runs through every year of his first 15 years until the end of 1499. There's a couple of periods where he feels, we can see as observers that there might be an observation from him that things have turned a corner and he's heading for a sunnier climate where there's not so many threats. But then the cycle of pressure changes, and there's another set of worries. So it's not surprising that his physical appearance begins to show that kind of inherent strain he's dealing with. And obviously then it becomes an emotional thing as well, as he loses his son Prince Arthur and his wife within a year, and old friends like Reginald Bray and John Morton, people who've been with him before he was king. He's no longer got those trusted advisors, implicitly trusted friends that have surrounded him. So he's basically going back to this position he was in the 1470s, where he's the sole responsibility for himself in what he's now carrying in his personal sort of deportment, but he's also then responsible for the country and for seeing his family's rule and power sustained. So that's an awful lot of stress and pressure to bear, and I think Pietro Torrigiano does a great job at kind of capturing that in the Death Mask, in the retrospective bust that the V&A has, which is Henry as a young man, but that's also taken from the Death Mask probably. But this funeral effigy is a kind of haunting picture of somebody who's really struggled and got through those struggles, but almost exhausted himself in doing so, and in many ways sacrificing all the things he might have wanted to do to overcome those problems, and then leave something behind for his son to inherit and hopefully go on to do good things with.
Yeah, it's a remarkable story, a victory against the odds, Henry becoming king, totally unexpected. As I've mentioned in the past, he was the great-great-great-grandson of a previous king, which makes him born the furthest away from the crown of any medieval king. I mean, people sometimes bring up the Hanoverians later on, but they are still the grandsons of a previous king. I mean, Henry is a complete outlier with no experience of even running a very small, modest estate. And it's remarkable that he becomes king with no preparation. I tell you what I love, and you did include this quote. It's one of my favourite quotes when it comes to Henry VII. It's by Philip de Comines, that French Burgundian chronicler who knew Henry personally. And he writes that Henry becomes king without power, without money, without right to the crown of England, and without any reputation but what his person and deportment obtained for him. And I think that's a very telling phrase, because people often consider Henry to be a charisma vacuum, but there's no way this man did not have something about him to encourage people to follow him when, as Comines says, he didn't have the right to the crown. He was able to galvanize support around him. So even though times were tough, even though his early life was very difficult, his spirit doesn't seem broken to me, certainly at the outset. of his reign.
That's right, and I think that's why we should think about Henry's character and personality as somebody who can galvanize all these people around himself, and has been in many ways thrust into this conspiracy against Richard III from 1483. He's not a natural choice of anyone really to lead a conspiracy and then a rebellion, and he's kind of engineered into this position by his mother. The members of Edward IV's household had wanted to see Edward V inherit the crown, and maybe Elizabeth Woodville thinking about a way to get her family back into the centre of power. So Henry is a figurehead, that's fine, but you want your leader in a rebellion to be charismatic, to be the guy who stands on a rock with his sword out and everyone's looking up and thinking, yeah, that's somebody we can follow into the breach or into the trenches. So he's definitely got to have something which attracts that support but also keeps it there. And I know there's some people who have cold feet in 1484 and early 1485, like the Marquis of Dorset, who basically try and come to a settlement with Richard III because they maybe don't see Henry as having the capacity or the resources to really challenge Richard. But he does get most people to stay on board and to launch that invasion from Normandy with a few thousand soldiers and a few ships. Almost a suicide mission, one way or another. But obviously, from running through all of that is this belief, this self-belief that he can actually do it. And maybe he's been given confidence by people like the Stanleys and the promise of support in South Wales and Jasper Tudor's network being revived. And there's quite a lot of good evidence that people do come to his banners quite quickly as he's marching towards the Midlands of England. But nevertheless, Richard III is sitting in Nottingham and Leicester with the huge resources of the north behind him, all of that time in the north in the 1470s to build up that personal connection. Even that alone should have brought enough soldiers to upset Henry's march, or to certainly have beaten him on the battlefield. So that sense of a charismatic leader with quite a lot of audacity, a lot of self-confidence, I think that's all there in the mix that we sometimes struggle to see in the records that we have. And that quote from Comines, a man who's spoken to him, and Henry's been quite open about, possibly feeling really fairly miserable about his chances in the 1470s, beginning to think that his world will never change. He needs some sort of seismic shift in the politics of England to give him that opportunity where all these other pieces can fall into place behind him. And, that does happen, but he's still got to do the deed. He's still got to take those guys with him and get the political network, which is where a lot of the women in his life are helping to smooth things out and lay the foundation. But that physical confrontation of Richard III, one way or another, still has to be achieved. And he does that. That's what's really impressive. He comes out of nowhere. He gets all of the pieces behind him, and he's able to, through luck, some battlefield congestion, some side switching by the Stanleys, some pausing, waiting to see what's going to happen. All these factors come into the picture, but nevertheless, Henry is the one who wins, and I think that's something he should be given enormous credit for in the circumstances of his life, what he's seen in the Wars of the Roses, how battles are precarious and hazardous, and basically a complete lottery in terms of who's going to win out. So he's ridden his luck. He's made all the preparations he can do, but he's certainly developed the charismatic personality that keeps people bound to his cause, and I think we should give him credit for that.
Hi, Nathan here. Please forgive my interruption, but I just wanted to let you know that here at Aspects of History, we produce a digital magazine featuring articles, interviews, short stories, and book reviews featuring the brightest and best historians and storytellers. Authors featured have included Lucy Worsley, Ben McIntyre, Andrew Roberts, and plenty more. An annual subscription featuring 6 issues costs just £9.99 or $9.99 for those of you across the pond. Head over to aspectsofhistory.com to subscribe or to gift a subscription to friends or family. Now, back to our show. Yes, I do note that in recent times, Richard III has been recharacterised as being the underdog at Bosworth, and there was only one underdog that day with the odds stacked against him, and that was Henry Tudor, Henry VII. I think it's Polydor Virgil who mentions that a couple of days before the battle, Henry actually goes missing, and the idea is that he's become spooked by the impending challenge. And I think that's a very interesting moment that's often glossed over, is Henry having second thoughts. He's having doubts because his life has been burdensome to this point. He is surrounded by people he doesn't know if he can trust. I think the deal with the Stanleys to betray Richard was probably made quite early on. It certainly wasn't this last minute thing at Bosworth, but it does seem to me that Henry is still having trust issues because life has shown him not to trust people. And this is evident in the run up to Bosworth. And quite frankly, this goes on throughout his reign. I mean, again, you've named your book Treason and Trust. It shows Henry's outlook, that his life is leading him to have a particular mindset. Now, he does want to portray his reign from the outset to be a peaceful one, the man who brings England out of civil war. But it most certainly was not peaceful. Do you just want to take us through some of those early struggles that he has, rebellion, defection, an assassination attempt even?
Yes, it's a tricky one, isn't it, for him? He's got to set off to be seen to be a king, to do all of the things which a king of England is expected to do. So in that sense, he projects this connection to tradition and custom. So his coronation is very traditional, very much like Richard III's. He calls Parliament and he does everything in the manner that's expected. He does ask the Lords to swear a new oath not to retain or to certainly maintain the law as the current retaining act of Edward IV in place, which is the recruitment of followers in return for rewards. So he's trying to be a traditional figure. He wants that calm period where things are contained, and certainly we can see Margaret Beaufort is sending to Sheriff Hutton Castle to get hold of the Yorkist children that are still around. So, and he's dating his reign to the day before Bosworth. It's seen as like legal tricks to try and trip people up, but he's really just trying to block off all the opportunities for things to rise up against him. He's not necessarily going to activate these powers. He just wants to make sure that people recognise he's in the pole position of authority now, and he wants them to just stop all of the infighting, the factionalism, which has really coloured the previous 2 years. And certainly he's also coming out of a conspiracy against Richard III, which he's been at the centre of. And we know there's been quite a lot of attempts to disrupt Richard's money supply, the way he can pay people on the front line of garrisons, on the coasts, the groups of retainers who are meant to be stopping someone like Henry landing on the coastline and marching unopposed to the middle of the country. So he's got to try and undo the things he's done to Richard to secure his own position. So all this takes time. And while he's doing this at the end of 1485, Richard's sister, Margaret of York, the Dowager Duchess of Burgundy, is already bringing the people who are disaffected with Henry's takeover, or maybe their missed opportunity to support Richard in the run-up to Bosworth for various reasons. She's beginning to, again, assemble rebels to immediately try and overthrow the Tudors. So this is Henry having acquired the throne, but immediately then facing the same kind of conspiracies that he's been part of. So in one respect, having become the expert at winning through conspiracy, he knows what to do to counter it. But on the other hand, he's got those resources that he needs just out of his reach, because he can't really trust, as you said, the people who are running the counties, the people who are Richard III's sheriffs. He appointed at Michaelmas in 1484. He's still got to deal with them in post. So how does he deal with local representatives of the crown, their kind of commitment or not to his position? Because he knows they can really undo things quite quickly in the locality. So he's got to trust, to some extent, the people who are just in post. Can they be professional enough to just follow through on the way government works without putting any political gloss on their activity? On the other hand, he knows he's got a very small number of people who he does trust. So they are very much anchored at the centre of the regime, given as many responsibilities as it's reasonable to give them without burning them out or overstretching them. But at some point, there's a crossover point or a buffer zone where he has to really commit to allowing people who might or might not have been his enemies, or certainly would have been indifferent, he has to give them some authority to represent himself. And this is where he leaves gaps in the way he set things up for threats and conspiracies to begin to reach him quite early on. So spring 1486, he has to make this first journey around the country to show himself off to the new Tudor subjects, so he can demonstrate that he is, everything they think he might be, but he's also countering all that propaganda Richard III has raised against him in proclamations. So he wants to be seen. He has to show the court as it travels with him to be this amalgamation of former Yorkists, former Ricardians, and older Lancastrians who've been waiting around for him to come and give them back their estates since the 1470s. So all of this is a mixed bag of loyalty and allegiance, which does bubble up into being pulled in different directions. And there's early defections from John de la Pole, the Earl of Lincoln, who was with Henry at York, but quite quickly after this assassination attempt through, I think it's Francis Lovell and Humphrey Stafford are both trying to generate separate cells of rebellion, which is again going to stretch Henry's loyalists into different parts of the country. So the Earl of Northumberland actually, having fought against Henry at Bosworth, is locked up in the Tower of London for a few months at the end of 1485, but then demonstrates his commitment by, I think, as we might hear from Polydore Virgil, literally saving Henry or intervening to stop this assassination attempt. So Henry can basically begin to see that people are showing their commitment. And from that point, he might begin to grow his core supporters, but at the same time, that network of conspiracy is also growing as people defect away from him or are tempted away by what Margaret of Burgundy can promise. And to accelerate that, we begin to see the rise of the pretenders, which you know all about from your books. But Lambert Simnel, the Earl of Warwick, certainly the Earl of Warwick as the Plantagenet figurehead around. There's no dispute about his status. The son of George, Duke of Clarence, a true blue-blooded prince of the ancient line, stands in strong contrast to Henry's own personal lineage and ancestry in terms of English politics anyway. So you can see then how the conspiracies would grow with that involvement, support and resources coming in from overseas. The blueprint of Henry's own seizure of the throne begins to be developed against him, and he deals with that in 1487, the Battle of Stoke, with a lot of Irish support. The Fitzgeralds have been promised that their status as the Yorkist figureheads in Ireland will be maintained much more strongly under a Yorkist king than this Lancastrian, who's also already thinking of restoring the Butler family, the Earls of Ormond, back to power. So the Lancastrian strand in Ireland is beginning to threaten the Yorkist legacy as well. So all these problems for Henry bubbling up and seem to be gaining momentum as the 1470s are moving towards their end. So that first 2 years is really quite a dangerous time, where again he has to rely on people like the Stanleys and the Earl of Northumberland to put themselves and their soldiers on the line. But there's actually the Earl of Oxford again, who wins the battle at Bosworth by taking all the hits in the melee. He does the same at the Battle of Stoke. So it's the trusted people who are put into the most peril by Henry, and no longer himself. He's very sensibly stepping back from the fighting. Now he's got the crown on his head rather than trying to gain it.
Yeah, I mean, one of the first things he does as king, of course, is he creates the Yeoman of the Guard, a permanent bodyguard to surround him and protect him at all times. And that hardly conveys a message of trust in his subjects. It's not exactly a good omen for his people about what this king thinks of them. But again, he is... People consider Henry to be a suspicious and a paranoid king because he was a usurper. And that's only one aspect of that. It's the fact that he was hunted down as a child throughout his time in exile. He was chased out of the kingdom at just 14 years old. This has all helped build, as I say, a particular mindset in Henry. And now he's become king. It certainly is my interpretation, at least, that he does intend to be a king who can reconcile both sides. He's a student of the game. He's looked at what's gone wrong and he's trying to correct that. But these conspiracies and these plots that are trying to undo him, as you say, he's become the blueprint of how to overthrow and kill a king. and he has seen personally what happened to Richard III. It's exacerbating his difficulty in trusting people, and this begins to manifest itself in how he looks to secure his grip on the throne. So, Sean, perhaps give us a little bit of an insight in how Henry does secure the grip on his throne. What are the weapons he uses to retain his crown?
Yeah, I think he's exploring that idea of trust quite in quite a complex way. Early on in the reign, he's not doing what he does later on, which is to use the threat of money and the fines that will generate to basically cripple people through their controlling their spending. Early on, he's offering quite a narrow opportunity for people to stay prominent and thrive in their local communities as representatives of their own power, but also of the crown. He's putting them under suspended financial penalties. So as long as they stay loyal on the terms he sets, then all these fines will not be activated. And he tests this out in Ireland in response to the Lambert Simnel Battle of Stoke moment, in that he sends Richard Edgecombe off to see if the Earl of Kildare can be persuaded to sign up to a lot of bonds to basically retain his position in Dublin, but under this massive raft of suspended fines. And this is gradually rolled out into England as well. So it's the threat in the background. It's saying, if you toe the line, you do what I want you to do, you'll have the freedom to do all the things you've always done in your community. So you'll be a man and a family of worth, and you'll be acknowledged as such by your communities, because I'll carry on giving you authority to represent the crown in all kinds of different ways. And you'll maybe get some nice grants and some gifts of office and some annuities, the things which will sustain your power representing the king. So in that sense, he's doing a fairly traditional thing, and these bonds have existed right through the way medieval kings worked, and Edward II did it in the 1320s after Thomas of Lancaster's rebellion in the same kind of way. So Henry, again, as you said, has looked back through history. He's picked up the tools that other kings have used. He's adapting for the circumstances he's facing. He might be bringing some desire to be more like a slightly more authoritarian French king, but as he said to the Venetian ambassador early in 1486, he's inherited the throne and he can't begin to tinker with things because literally the people won't stand for it after all this period of civil war. So he knows he's got to try and follow the normal pathway of kingship, but he knows he's also got to try and enhance his own power in relation to other people's, because he doesn't want to be in a position where the decisions of 2 or 3 nobles and the resources they can command could upset him. And your point about the yeomen of the guard is to secure that physical space that he and his family are in, because the other aspect of Renaissance diplomacy and Renaissance living was silent assassinations in royal palaces, and there's all sorts of stories of poisonings and quick murders and things like that. So he's aware of all this stuff from what he's observed around Europe, and he needs to build the trust that he can. So he will try and extend slowly the authority he gives to people, and he does demonstrate his kind of attraction, his memory of people who've been loyal to him. He brings back his old Welsh nurse. He goes to visit Anne Devereux on his first progress into the Welsh marches. He goes to see the woman who's basically looked after him when he was a child, when he was a ward of William Herbert. So in that sense, he does remember these people who've put their efforts out for him, and he's willing to give people the opportunity to carry on being loyal. It's that balance of a king which is untested and untried against these quite sophisticated conspiracies from people who are prominent figures in the history of English families that have ruled the country. How does that balance out in terms of where people's loyalty should be? So having got rid of the threat from Lambert Simnel, 1489, he invests Prince Arthur as Prince of Wales, and Princess Margaret is born in November 1489. So at that moment, the court is together. He seems to have sorted out Ireland, but then Perkin Warbeck appears on the scene. So it's a sense of these waves of calm and then almost real turbulence and potential disaster. And so Henry has to then face a new set of threats in the same kind of ballpark of a sponsored figurehead who can draw people's loyalty away from him because of the nature of that jigsaw puzzle of allegiance, which has propelled him to the throne in the first place. He's got to try and hold that all together again. So that effort he made in 1483 to 85 then has to be sustained as king to keep the royal connection together on board for the Tudors, rather than to dissipate and begin to support candidates who are rivals to the Tudor power. So he's doing a lot of that personal work. He's doing a lot of interviews directly. There's reports of him actually speaking to the rebels in 1487 and 1489, the Yorkshire Tax Rebellion. He takes another army into the north. He'll interview people directly. He likes to look people in the eye and get a sense of their personality and their commitment from the way they appear to him. So he's a man who bases a lot of his decisions on that kind of personal connection. And I think he feels defection very strongly because of that. So when Sir William Stanley begins to investigate whether Perkin Warbeck might be Prince Richard of York, he begins to test out the news networks to see if he can really discover the truth. Henry sees this as a betrayal because that trust should be locked in, and it's beginning to be undone because he can't contain these stories of alternatives. And as that decade progresses, Henry's ability to sort of contain all the steps that the Warbeck plot takes becomes less easy to contain, especially when James IV of Scotland gets involved and Maximilian Habsburg gets involved in kind of propelling the size of this threat and promising the resources that could unseat the Tudors, just as Henry had done with Breton and French support in 1484 and 85. So it's a pattern that's repeated. Henry's a master at this game by then, and he knows what to do, but it doesn't make the threat or the prospect any less traumatic or threatening.
Well, yes. I mean, you've mentioned Perkin Warbeck there. We certainly do not have enough time to go into the full story of Warbeck's appearance, but suffice to say, you mention Warbeck in your book as representing an existential threat to the Tudors, and that's precisely what Warbeck's surfacing was, whether he truly was a French-inspired plot to get back at Henry Tudor for siding with the Bretons, as I am content to believe, or whether he was Prince Richard, one of the princes in the Tower, reborn. We will never know, but the fact is his appearance did represent a significant threat to Henry. It did heighten his tensions, and it is the moment where he begins to really take hold of the kingdom by, disseminating these spy networks out through his people. I mean, you mentioned that data and information is what becomes most valuable to Henry. He wants to know what his subjects are up to, because if he can know what they're doing, he can get ahead of the conspiracies, and he does. It works for him. His spy network is crucial in bringing down these plots, but so too is money. So, as one of the founders, one of the leading minds behind the Tudor Chamber Books project, which looks at Henry and his money, please can you settle this once and for all? Was Henry Tudor, Henry VII, a miser, or was he not?
I don't think he was a miser in the sense of just loving to have money around. I think he saw the value of money from what it allowed people to do and what it allowed the kingdom to do. Security comes through having full coffers, and then what you spend that money on can be frivolous, it can be hunting and gold plate, or it can be the sort of stuff which cements your power. So Henry, he definitely likes that flow of cash, because knowing he's got control of money and has full coffers means he can deploy that money to secure his position. So the commentary that we see from, Pedro de Ayala, the Spanish ambassador, that Henry can never be a great man because he loves his account books and his money too much. That's in many ways grandstanding for the European audience, and it's a soundbite for the circumstances of that Spanish relationship, which Henry's trying to navigate at various times. So Henry, again, when he's in trouble after 1503, when his wife dies, he begins to see the resources of the great people of the country, merchants, churchmen, nobles, as a potential way they can undermine him again because they could pool their resources, buy mercenaries, as William Stanley allegedly had done with bags of groat coins in his castle at Holt near Wrexham, enough to pay for several thousand soldiers for a 2 or 3 week campaign. That's the way that money could be used. So Henry doesn't necessarily want to acquire money just to have it sitting there. I mean, he does like the effect of having a wall full of gold plate. He does that with the Spanish at Prince Arthur's wedding in 1501. He demonstrates his magnificence literally by having a set of gold dishes on the wall and then serving the meal on another set. So he knows the value of spending money wisely. But he is always spending. He doesn't just bring the money in and keep it idle. He is able to pay these massive bribes to the Habsburgs after 1503 when he's trying to contain Edmund de la Pole, the brother of John who led the forces against Henry at the Battle of Stoke. He again sets himself up as a Yorkist claimant and goes off to the continent to have the Habsburgs potentially launch another invasion to back him. It doesn't really happen for him, but Henry is again using that spy network, that information gathering system, and above all, the power of money to contain this. And the money he spends is to basically bankroll Maximilian's aim to be the Holy Roman Emperor and also help him with what's going on in his eastern lands in Eastern Europe. So Henry's wealth allows him to be a higher level political player, but he also knows that wealth, if it's in his subjects' hands, could be put to purposes he wouldn't want to see. So money is the key to how his power is generated and exercised, but it's always being put to work. It's not just an idle accumulation for the sake of having it. In that sense, not a miser, but very much tuned into the power of wealth and what it can be used for.
And there we have it. Henry VII, officially not a miser, but a very, very avaricious king. I often say he's not a miser, which is an Ebenezer Scrooge type figure, but he was a very greedy man, but it all made sense. It was a strategy to outspend his domestic rivals and also bribe his external rivals. It all served a purpose. And unlike kings before or afterwards, I would certainly rather lose my coin to the king than my head. Let's put it that way. One thing I noticed about Henry, and this is going to take this podcast in a weird direction. Last night, I watched the new Gordon Ramsay documentary series. And it was brought up that Gordon Ramsay has accumulated quite a lot of wealth, but he's constantly on the move to keep going, to keep pressing forward. And that's all tied in to the fact that as a child, he had nothing. And I always think that's the case with Henry VII as well. He, up until the age of 28, he had no control over his fate. He had no independent wealth of his own. He had no control over what to do with his life. And I think once he does become king, he very jealously guards his power, and he does see money to be in the way to security. And quite frankly, I think it worked. You mention in the book, you use a quote that throughout his life, he was never destined to draw a peaceful breath. It certainly was a very difficult life. I think you call it a reign that was very unusual and uncomfortable, and he was a man who never was able to enjoy the trappings of his crown. But here's the crucial question to end. Once you'd completed your study of Henry, do you think it was all worth it? Was Henry's reign, and was the difficulties and the burdens that he endured, and the difficulties and the burdens he imposed on his subjects, was it worth it in the end?
Worth it for him and the country, I suppose, in that he did end that period of civil war, and there's no way to understand what might have happened had he fallen out of the picture in 1485. Richard might have reigned for a lot longer, might have not had so many threats, but who knows how the country might have developed in terms of external pressures, Richard's ambitions to do different things. We didn't really get a sense of Richard as a king and where he might be going from that short reign that he had. So we can kind of think that Henry came in with that struggle to establish a character and a visibility for himself. And as you say, to secure his position, it required these difficult decisions because he'd come from nothing and he was unknown. He had this propaganda to work against. He had to get people on side. He had to ensure that the threats diminished, but that his power didn't really get abused by himself or the people representing him. And I think had those threats to the Tudor crown gone away, we might have seen a very different Henry VII beginning to build these blocks of a reign which was much more like the traditional patterns, but had this continental these continental elements brought in a lot more obvious ways. And certainly you can see that in the way he rebuilt Sheen Palace as Richmond, the way he's thinking about politics on a grand European scale. He's almost thinking of the New World with John Cabot and the Voyages of Exploration, all almost to sort of work against the Spanish and the Portuguese. So he's got ambitions. He's definitely wants to put England in a stronger position in Europe, and he cleverly doesn't want to run the risk of having English soldiers and Welsh soldiers fighting for him in battles in the far-flung places like Italy or going on crusade to Morocco. He's thinking about money doing the heavy lifting for English influence. So in that sense, he's sophisticated. He leaves an awful lot of cash for Henry VIII to set off on the right foot with, and you might say that money's been generated by quite a ruthless clampdown and using the royal prerogative powers, these inherent powers of the crown to demand payments for that relationship between the king and his leading subjects. So he milks that system so to the point where he doesn't actually need to call Parliament or raise taxes in the normal way, and yet still leaves a surplus for Henry VIII to begin that grand ambition to renew the 100 Years' War almost as soon as he can get on his horse. So in that sense, it's worth it because it stopped internal fighting and it allowed the country to think about returning to something which was a more positive. We would see it as a strangely kind of warlike, aggressive English kingdom wanting to recover those French lands, to be a European power in the same sense as Spain now emerging in a different way, and France as it was almost a superpower in itself. So England is more ambitious because of Henry. It's also more capable because of the resources Henry's put in place for his family to take forward after he's gone. It was a struggle and it was difficult, and I think for people connected to the crown, working with the crown to run the country, it was a very difficult period after 1503, and we might have seen violence and disruption rising up again, as was alleged against Richard Empson and Edmund Dudley in 1509, that they were planning for a coup to keep control of Prince Henry after Henry VII's death. Whether that's true or not, it's clearly a plausible suggestion to allow their prosecution to happen. So the return to civil war as a threat of cataclysm and real step backwards into the turbulence of civil war is presented to people as a consequence of not following through on Henry's plan and supporting Prince Henry in the new reign. So it's a fascinating period of gamesmanship in trying to balance the traditional way of running with this imperative to stop civil conflict, to make the royal family preeminent and deserving of everybody's loyalty, and then to leave some sort of legacy that everybody can get behind, whether that's in good government, whether that's in foreign ambition and warfare, or if it's just in being a royal family everybody can look up to because they are the pinnacle and they are the paragons and the icons that English subjects have always wanted, the sort of Henry V, young Edward III kind of figurehead. So they've got that in a teenage Henry VIII. It's up to him and the people around him to take that forward. And I think Henry VII has struggled through his reign to set that up and almost thought about the sacrifices he is making to ensure that his heir doesn't have to endure the same kind of life and reign that he's gone through. So in that sense, he'll see it's worth it because he's got to the end point in a way where all the things he'd hoped for are in place. There's been tragedy along the way, and it's not the same heir that he'd put all that investment and training into. He doesn't have a wife by his side to share that at the end, but he has achieved the things he would have wanted to achieve at the start of his reign, and in that sense, it's worth it. And we can see it now as a foundation for how the country developed subsequently. So in that sense, yes, it's an achievement that's worth holding on to, really, in terms of England's progression.
Sean, I think this is an incredible achievement in what you've done. You've been able to condense Henry's very complex reign into a succinct overview, while not omitting any of the details that we need to gain a full picture of not just the king, but the man. You show in your book that it was a stressful, uncomfortable, and burdensome reign. You call it exceptionally strange, but I'm very pleased to say that your book was anything but. You show with great detail and great insight how an unknown Welshman, as Richard III called him, was able to bring down the mighty Plantagenets. I've got to say, your book is a joy to have in the collection and a pride of place on my shelves. And I hope, dear listener, that you do go out as soon as possible and pick up your own copy. Sean Cunningham, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thanks very much, Nathan. That's been really enjoyable. Great to speak with you.
Thank you all for listening today. Links, as always, are in the show notes. Please share the podcast with friends and family, and if you do want to get in touch with us, please do so through our website at aspectsofhistory.com. Until then, thank you so much for joining us.